In the heart of Birmingham, Alabama, a black man owned a struggling auto repair shop. On a freezing Thanksgiving evening, while most people were gathered around dinner tables with their families, he made a different choice. He stopped to help a stranded family whose car had broken down on the highway. He sacrificed his own holiday plans to get them back on the road. What he didn't know was that this simple act of kindness would set off a chain of events that would change his life forever. Elijah Carter sat hunched over his desk in the dimly lit office of Carter Auto Repair, rubbing his temples as he stared at the pile of unpaid bills scattered before him. The numbers weren't adding up. Business had been slow for months, and with the economy struggling, fewer people were coming in for repairs unless it was absolutely necessary. His once thriving shop, built with years of sweat and dedication, was now barely staying afloat. He had already let one of his mechanics go, and if things didn't improve soon, he would have to make even tougher decisions. The thought of closing down weighed heavily on him. This shop wasn't just a business, it was his father's legacy, something Elijah had worked tirelessly to keep alive. Outside, the late November wind howled, rattling the windows, sending a chill through the garage even with the heater running. It was the day before Thanksgiving, and while most people in Birmingham were busy preparing for a warm meal with family, Elijah was stuck here, trying to figure out how to keep the lights on for another month. His phone buzzed, breaking his concentration. He glanced at the screen and saw his sister's name. "Hey, Jasmine," he answered, trying to sound upbeat despite the exhaustion in his voice. "Hey, big brother," her voice was warm, filled with that familiar mix of concern and affection. "You're still coming for Thanksgiving tomorrow, right? The kids are excited to see their Uncle Elijah." He sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Yeah, of course. I'll be there at 5. He heard the hesitation in her voice before she spoke again. "You sure? You don't sound too good." He forced a chuckle. "Just a long day, that's all. But yeah, I'll be there. Tell the kids to save me a big plate." "You got it," she said, but the concern in her voice lingered. "See you tomorrow." As soon as he hung up, he ran a tired hand down his face. He wanted to be there for his niece and nephew, but his mind was preoccupied with the growing debt and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Still, for one evening, he would put his worries aside and enjoy a good meal with family. He had to. The next morning, Elijah woke early, throwing himself into work, hoping to clear his mind. He spent the day tuning up cars, replacing brakes and checking oil levels, but the truth was, there weren't many customers. The holiday season was always slow, and this year felt worse than usual. By the time 4:30 rolled around, he was ready to lock up. He grabbed his worn leather jacket, sipped it up against the bitter cold, and stepped outside toward his truck. Snow flurries were already drifting down, covering the pavement in a thin white layer. He took a deep breath, appreciating the quiet for a moment before pulling out his keys. Then his phone rang. An unfamiliar number flashed on the screen. He hesitated before answering. "Carter Auto Repair, this is Elijah." A woman's voice, laced with urgency, came through the speaker. "Oh, thank God. Is this the owner? Please, we need help. Our car just broke down on Highway 65. We've been trying every shop around, but no one's answering. It's so cold out here, and we have 2 little kids with us." Elijah stiffened. He glanced at his watch. He was supposed to be on the road to his sister's house right now. The smell of cornbread, collard greens, and turkey had already been in his mind since this morning. He thought about his niece and nephew, how excited they were to see him. But then he heard the faint sound of children crying in the background through the phone. And that was all it took. "Where exactly are you?" he asked, already turning back toward the shop. "Mile marker 78, near the exit to Montgomery," the woman replied, her voice shaking, either from the cold or fear or both. "The car just died out of nowhere. My husband tried everything, but it won't start." Elijah exhaled, knowing there was no way he could leave them out there. "Hang tight," he said. "I'll be there as soon as I can." He quickly called Jasmine. "Listen, sis, I'm really sorry, but something came up. There's a family stuck on the highway, and they got kids with them. I gotta go help." There was a pause, but then she sighed. "I knew you'd say that. Just be careful, okay? And if you finish early, there's still a plate waiting for you." "Thanks, Jazz," he said, already grabbing his keys. "I'll see you soon." As he pulled out of the parking lot, the snow began falling harder, making the road slick. His truck's headlights cut through the early evening darkness as he navigated the nearly empty highway. He had seen enough roadside accidents to know how dangerous it could be, especially in this weather. After 20 minutes, he spotted a black SUV parked awkwardly on the shoulder, its hazard lights blinking against the growing snowfall. A man was standing outside, waving a flashlight. Elijah pulled over and stepped out, his boots crunching against the icy pavement. The cold hit him immediately, seeping through his jacket, but he ignored it. The man, who looked to be in his early 40s, had a strong build but was clearly distressed. "Are you Elijah?" he asked. "Yeah, you must be Marcus," Elijah replied, shaking his gloved hand. "What happened?" "I have no idea," Marcus said, running a hand over his shaved head. "1 minute everything was fine, then the engine just cut out. Won't turn over, no lights, nothing." Elijah nodded and peeked into the car. Inside, a woman Lauren, he assumed was wrapped in a blanket, holding their 2 young kids close. The kids, no older than 6 or 7, looked up at Elijah with wide, frightened eyes. He turned back to Marcus. "Pop the hood. Let's see what we're dealing with." The moment he checked the engine, he knew this wasn't going to be an easy fix. The electrical system had completely shut down, and with the cold setting in, the battery was likely frozen. "Bad news," he said, closing the hood. "This isn't a quick roadside fix. You're going to need a tow and a warm place to wait while I work on it." Marcus glanced at his wife, then back at Elijah. "How long?" "Could be a few hours," Elijah admitted. "Maybe more, depending on what I find once we get it to the shop." Lauren's face fell. "We were on our way to Atlanta. My mother, she had a heart attack. The doctors aren't sure if she's going to make it through the night." Her voice cracked on the last word, and Marcus placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Elijah felt a pang in his chest. He had been in their shoes before. His own mother had passed suddenly, and he never got the chance to say goodbye. He wasn't about to let that happen to someone else. "Look, I'll do whatever I can to get you back on the road as fast as possible," he promised. "Let's get you out of the cold first." As Marcus and Lauren nodded in gratitude, Elijah grabbed his towing chains. The night was just beginning, and there was a long road ahead, but he had made his choice. He just didn't know yet how much that choice was about to change his life. Elijah worked quickly, securing the heavy chains to the undercarriage of the SUV as the snow thickened around him, sticking to his jacket and stinging his exposed skin. His fingers, despite the thick gloves, were already beginning to feel numb from the cold, but he powered through, double-checking every latch to make sure the car was stable before stepping back and nodding to Marcus. "All right, it's hooked up. I'll tow you to my shop. It's about 10 minutes from here, and it's warm inside. Your family can wait there while I figure out what's wrong." Marcus exhaled a breath of relief, glancing at Lauren, who gave a small nod from inside the SUV. "Man, I can't thank you enough," Marcus said, clapping a cold hand on Elijah's shoulder before rushing back to his car. Elijah climbed into his truck, turned up the heat, and put the vehicle into gear, feeling the slight resistance as the weight of the SUV pulled behind him. As he drove, he kept checking his mirrors, making sure the vehicle was still secure and that Marcus and his family were doing all right. The road was slick, the snow coming down faster now, reducing visibility to just a few feet ahead. The wipers worked overtime, but even they struggled against the freezing mix of ice and sleet. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel. The last thing they needed was another accident. When they finally reached Carter Auto Repair, Elijah pulled into the lot and carefully backed the SUV into one of the garage bays. He parked, turned off the engine, and hopped out, shaking off the cold as he unhooked the chains. Marcus helped Lauren and the kids out of the SUV, guiding them toward the shop's small waiting area. It wasn't much, just a couple of old but comfortable chairs, a small TV mounted on the wall, and a coffee machine that had seen better days, but at least it was warm. The moment they stepped inside, Lauren let out a shaky breath and pulled the kids closer. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice still tight with emotion. "This means more than you know." Elijah gave a reassuring nod. "I get it," he said simply, not elaborating. He knew there was nothing he could say that would ease the fear of possibly losing a parent. Instead, he turned to Marcus. "I'll get started on the car. If you need anything, just holler." Marcus watched as Elijah grabbed his toolbox and got to work, rolling up his sleeves despite the lingering cold in the garage. He hesitated for a moment before stepping aside and pulling out his phone. He walked toward the far end of the waiting area, speaking in hushed tones into the receiver. Elijah didn't think much of it. He assumed Marcus was calling family, letting them know the situation. Instead, he focused on the SUV, popping the hood and immediately confirming what he had suspected earlier. The electrical system was completely shot. Something had shorted out, maybe a faulty alternator or a wiring issue deep in the system. It wasn't just a dead battery, this was going to take some real work. He let out a long breath, rubbing a hand over his beard as he calculated the fastest way to fix it. He wasn't about to let this family stay stranded any longer than necessary, especially not with two little kids who looked like they were barely holding it together. The girl, the older of the two, kept clinging to her mother's side, but the little boy had started to fidget, clearly restless. Lauren must have noticed because she dug through her bag and pulled out a set of coloring books and crayons, handing them over to keep the kids occupied. Elijah caught a glimpse of the book's high quality, thick pages, the kind you didn't just pick up at the corner store. Everything about this family, from their clothes to the way they carried themselves, suggested money. But he pushed the thought aside. It didn't matter. He grabbed his tools and got to work, the hum of the overhead lights buzzing in the quiet garage as he removed the damaged components and started installing new parts. Time passed in a blur, the repetitive rhythm of his work keeping him focused. Occasionally, he glanced up to see Marcus still on the phone, his face unreadable, or Lauren softly murmuring to the kids, her expression tense. He worked faster. He knew what it felt like to sit in that kind of uncertainty, to be helpless in the face of something you couldn't control. He remembered the night his own mother had been rushed to the hospital years ago, how he'd sat in a cold waiting room, praying for more time, how those prayers had gone unanswered. He clenched his jaw and tightened a bolt. Not this time. By the time he was finishing up, his hands were aching, stiff from the hours of work. He wiped his forehead, smearing grease across his skin before stepping back and rolling his shoulders. The SUV was running again, the engine humming steadily under the hood. He let out a breath of relief and turned to find Marcus standing nearby, watching him. "All set," Elijah said, reaching for a rag to wipe his hands. "She should run just fine now, but I'd still recommend getting her checked again when you get to Atlanta, just to be safe." Marcus stared at him for a moment before nodding. "I don't even know what to say," he admitted. "You didn't have to do all this, especially on a holiday." Elijah shrugged. "Didn't feel right leaving you out there, not with your kids in the car." He hesitated before adding, "I know what it's like to not get a chance to say goodbye. If I can help make sure you don't go through that, I will." Something in Marcus's expression shifted, something deeper, but he didn't press. Instead, he reached for his wallet. "How much do I owe you?" Elijah sighed, glancing toward the register where he usually calculated bills. He knew what the parts had cost, over $800 easily. Labor. That would have been another few hundred at least. But as he looked at Lauren, who was now bundling up the kids, her face still drawn with worry, he made a decision. "Just cover the parts," he said finally. "No charge for labor. Consider it a Thanksgiving gift." Marcus blinked. "Are you serious?" "Yeah," Elijah nodded, shoving his hands into his pockets. "Like I said, I just wanted to help." Lauren made a choked sound, and before Elijah could react, she stepped forward and hugged him. It was brief, just a quick, grateful squeeze before she pulled back, wiping at her eyes. "You have no idea what this means to us," she whispered. Marcus pulled out his wallet and handed Elijah enough cash to cover the parts, then reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a business card. "Take this," he said, pressing it into Elijah's hand. "If you ever need anything, call me." Elijah barely glanced at it before slipping it into his pocket with a nod. "Safe travels," he said, as Marcus and Lauren gathered their kids and headed for the SUV. The kids waved shyly before climbing inside, and then, just like that, they were gone, disappearing into the snowy night. Elijah let out a breath, rubbing his hands together for warmth before locking up the shop. He was exhausted, his body sore. But there was something deeply satisfying about knowing he had done the right thing. He had no idea that the business card now sitting in his pocket would soon change everything. The next morning, Elijah arrived at his shop earlier than usual, the crisp morning air biting at his skin as he unlocked the garage doors. The heater had barely warmed up the space when he shrugged off his jacket and got to work, checking inventory, going through invoices, anything to keep himself busy. His body ached from the long hours of labor the night before, but he didn't regret a single second of it. He hadn't thought much about Marcus or his family since they left. He had done what needed to be done, nothing more. Still, something about their gratitude had stuck with him in a way he couldn't quite explain. Maybe because it had reminded him of his mother, of all the times she had put others before herself, of how she had taught him that kindness wasn't about expecting anything in return. It was just about doing what was right. It wasn't until he reached into his pocket, searching for a pen, that his fingers brushed against the small rectangular card Marcus had handed him. He pulled it out, glancing at it absently at first. But the moment he read the name, his breath caught in his throat. Marcus Bennett, CEO, Bennett Motors. His eyes flickered to the company logo, the sleek silver insignia that had been stamped onto countless auto parts he had installed over the years. Bennett Motors wasn't just some local business, it was one of the largest automotive manufacturers in the country, supplying parts to repair shops and dealerships across the nation. Elijah let out a low whistle, leaning against his workbench as he processed the realization. He had spent hours fixing the car of one of the most powerful men in the industry, and he hadn't even known it. A part of him wondered if he should have charged full price, but that thought was fleeting. He shook his head, chuckling under his breath. It wouldn't have changed a thing. He had done what was right, and that was all that mattered. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but as the week went on, the weight of his financial trouble settled back onto his shoulders. Business remained slow, the phone barely ringing, and with the end of the month approaching, the overdue bills stacked higher. He tried to ignore the stress, tried to keep his head down and push through, but the reality was impossible to escape. The bank had already sent him a final notice. If he didn't come up with the money soon, Carter Auto Repair wouldn't just be struggling, it would be gone. Then, on a cold December morning, everything changed. Elijah was in the middle of changing the oil on an old pickup truck when he heard the sound of tires crunching over gravel outside. He wiped his hands on a rag and glanced toward the entrance, expecting another customer in need of a quick fix. Instead, he saw something that made him freeze in place. A black luxury SUV rolled into the lot, the kind that screamed wealth, its sleek exterior polished to perfection despite the winter grime on the roads. Right behind it, a second vehicle, just as expensive looking, pulled up and parked. Elijah straightened, brow furrowing. This wasn't the kind of traffic he usually saw around here. The doors of the first SUV opened, and out stepped Marcus Bennett. This time he wasn't in travel-worn clothes and a heavy winter jacket. He was wearing a sharp, tailored suit, the kind that probably cost more than what Elijah made in a month. Elijah tossed the rag onto the workbench and walked forward, wiping his hands on his jeans as Marcus approached. "Morning," Elijah greeted, trying to keep his voice neutral. "Didn't expect to see you again." Marcus smiled, shaking his hand firmly. "Good to see you, Elijah. I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced." Elijah raised an eyebrow, glancing at the second vehicle. Two men in business attire stepped out, both looking like the kind of guys who dealt in numbers and contracts. "I'd say I'm a little surprised," Elijah admitted. "Everything all right with the car?" Marcus chuckled. "The car's running perfectly thanks to you. But that's not why I'm here." He glanced around the garage, taking in the worn equipment, the faded paint on the walls, the signs of a business that had seen better days. "I did some research on you after that night," he continued. "Asked around. You've got a hell of a reputation, Elijah. People trust you. They say you do honest work, that you don't cut corners, that you take care of folks even when it costs you." Elijah shrugged, suddenly feeling self-conscious. "Just doing my job." Marcus nodded. "That's exactly what I'm looking for." He gestured toward the two men standing by the second SUV. "I'm expanding Bennett Motors. We're launching a network of certified service centers across the country, places where people can go knowing they'll get fair pricing and quality work. No dealership upselling, no hidden fees, just honest service from people who know their craft. And I want this shop to be our first flagship location." Elijah blinked. He was certain he had misheard. "You want my shop?" Marcus shook his head. "I want you. This place has something money can't buy: trust. Your name means something in this community. That's what we need, and I don't want to take it away from you. I want to invest in it." Elijah crossed his arms, skeptical. "And what does that investment look like?" Marcus smiled. "Full funding for renovations, new equipment, additional staff, whatever it takes to bring this place up to speed. You'd still be the owner. You'd run it the way you see fit. The only difference? You'd have the full backing of Bennett Motors. No more worrying about bills. No more struggling to keep the doors open. Elijah stared at him, struggling to process what he was hearing. He had spent the past few months wondering how he was going to save his shop, and now here was a man offering him everything he needed on a silver platter. It felt unreal, too good to be true. "What's the catch?" he asked finally. Marcus chuckled. "No catch. Just one condition." He met Elijah's gaze, serious now. "You keep doing what you've always done. Keep treating people right. Keep running this place with the same integrity you showed my family that night. That's what matters to me." Elijah exhaled slowly, his mind racing. He thought about his father, about all the years of hard work that had gone into building this place. He thought about the stress of the past few months, the sleepless nights spent wondering if he was going to lose everything. And then he thought about what this could mean not just for him, but for his community. More jobs, more opportunities, more people getting the help they needed without having to worry about being taken advantage of. He looked back at Marcus, his jaw tightening before he finally spoke. "All right," he said, extending his hand. "Let's do it." Marcus's smile widened as he shook Elijah's hand firmly. "You won't regret this." As the businessman stepped forward with paperwork, Elijah took one last look around the shop, the same shop that, in just a few months, would be transformed into something bigger than he had ever imagined. He had spent years wondering if his hard work and honesty would ever pay off. Now, standing in the middle of his garage, shaking hands with one of the most influential men in the industry, he had his answer. And it had all started with a single act of kindness. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. Elijah barely had time to process what had happened before the transformation of Carter Auto Repair was already in motion. Marcus Bennett wasn't the kind of man to waste time. The moment Elijah signed the contract, things moved fast. The very next morning, a team of contractors arrived at the shop, taking measurements, discussing layouts, making plans for renovations that Elijah had only dreamed about but never thought possible. New lifts, state-of-the-art diagnostic machines, a complete overhaul of the waiting area. Things that had once seemed like luxuries for a struggling mechanic were now being installed without him having to worry about a single dime. At first it was overwhelming. Elijah had spent so long scraping by that the idea of not having to fight for every dollar, of not having to check the bank account before ordering parts, felt foreign. He had built his shop with his own two hands, every tool, every piece of equipment purchased, one at a time over years of hard work. Now he was watching crews tear out old machinery and bring in sleek, brand new tools that most independent mechanics would never even get to touch. There were moments when he felt a flicker of doubt, when he wondered if he was losing something in the process. But every time that thought crept in, he reminded himself that the heart of the shop wasn't changing. It was still his. Marcus had kept his word. Elijah remained the owner, the one calling the shots. The only difference now was that he had the resources to do what he had always wanted, to serve his community without the constant fear of losing everything. He hired back the mechanic he had been forced to let go months ago, then brought on two more. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't just surviving, he was growing. The grand reopening was scheduled for early spring, and as word spread through Birmingham, excitement built. People who had been customers for years stopped by just to see the progress, to congratulate Elijah on what they called a well-earned blessing. But Elijah didn't see it as luck or even as a reward. He saw it as proof that doing the right thing, even when no one was watching, could lead to something bigger than he had ever imagined. One evening, as the final touches were being put in place, Elijah was in his office, looking over paperwork, when the bell at the front door jingled. He glanced up, expecting one of his employees, but instead, he found Lauren Bennett standing there, her children at her side. The last time he had seen her, she had been exhausted and worried, barely holding it together. Now she looked different. Relaxed. At peace. She smiled warmly. "I hope we're not interrupting." Elijah stood, waving her in. "Not at all," he said, setting his papers aside. "Come on in." The kids ran forward, and to his surprise, the little boy reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, holding it out to Elijah like a prized possession. "I made this for you," he said shyly. Elijah took the paper, unfolding it carefully. It was a crayon drawing of a car, big and boxy, with a stick figure version of himself standing beside it, smiling. Above it, in uneven handwriting, were the words, "Mr. Elijah, the best fixer." Elijah chuckled, a warmth spreading through his chest as he looked down at the drawing. "This is amazing," he said, crouching slightly to meet the boy's gaze. "You got my beard just right." Lauren laughed. "He's been talking about you ever since that night. Both of them have." She paused, her expression turning more serious. "I just wanted to come by and thank you again, properly this time. We made it to Atlanta that night. My mother, she held on just long enough for us to see her. She passed the next morning, but she got to say goodbye to her grandkids. And that was because of you." Elijah nodded, swallowing against the lump in his throat. "I'm glad you made it," he said quietly. "I really am." Lauren exhaled, glancing around the shop. "Marcus told me what he's doing here. He told me it started because of that night." She met Elijah's gaze. "You didn't just fix a car, Elijah. You changed everything for us." Elijah shook his head. "I just did what anyone would have done." Lauren smiled knowingly. "No, you did what the right kind of person would do." Elijah didn't have an answer for that, so he simply nodded, looking back at the drawing in his hands. It was simple, just crayons on paper, but it meant more to him than anything money could buy. After they left, he pinned it to the wall in his office, right next to a framed photo of his mother, because at the end of the day, that drawing was a reminder of why he did what he did. As the grand reopening approached, the shop underwent a final transformation. A new sign was installed above the front entrance, sleek and modern, yet still familiar. It read, "Carter's Auto Care, a Bennett Motors partner." The night before the grand opening, Marcus invited Elijah to an industry event in Atlanta, introducing him to some of the biggest names in the business. "Elijah Carter, the man who showed me what true service looks like," Marcus would say, each time shaking his hand like an equal. But no matter how big the shop got, no matter how many connections he made, Elijah stayed the same. He still got his hands dirty, still worked under the hood when his mechanics needed backup, still greeted every customer like they were an old friend. The only difference now was that he didn't have to worry about losing it all. And every Thanksgiving after that, Carter's Auto Care stayed open not for business but for emergencies. Anyone stranded, anyone who needed help, found the doors open, just like they had been for Marcus and his family that night. 3 years later, Elijah stood outside his shop as a new customer pulled in a father with his 2 kids in the back seat, looking desperate, their car barely making it into the lot. Elijah smiled, wiping his hands on a rag as he stepped forward. "Let's see what we're working with," he said, already rolling up his sleeves. The years that followed were nothing short of extraordinary. What had once been a struggling auto repair shop on the brink of shutting down had transformed into a thriving business, a cornerstone of the community and a model for ethical service across the industry. But despite all the growth, all the changes, Elijah Carter remained exactly who he had always been, a man who believed in doing right by people, in fixing more than just cars, in making sure that anyone who walked into his shop left with more than just a working vehicle. Carter's Auto Care became the flagship service center for Bennett Motors, the first of many, but no matter how much corporate backing he had, Elijah refused to let it lose the personal touch that had always made it special. Customers still called him by name, and he still knew their stories: the single mother who struggled to afford repairs, the elderly man who had been bringing his pickup to the shop since the day Elijah's father ran it, the young mechanics who came through his doors looking for work and left with skills they could build a future on. And it wasn't just about the cars. He had created a foundation that trained underprivileged youth in auto repair, giving them a chance to build careers, to learn a trade that could help them stand on their own. Marcus had matched every dollar Elijah put into it, turning what had started as a small local initiative into a statewide program that changed hundreds of lives. Every Thanksgiving, the shop remained open not for business but for emergencies. It had become a tradition, an unspoken promise to anyone in need. If you were stranded, if you had nowhere else to turn, if the road had left you behind, Carter's Auto Care would be there for you. The employees volunteered their time, knowing they were a part of something bigger. Elijah always made sure that every stranded traveler who came in that day left not only with their car fixed but with a warm meal, a cup of coffee, and the assurance that kindness still existed in the world. It was during one of those Thanksgiving shifts, 3 years after that fateful snowy night, that Elijah found himself working on another car late into the evening. A father and his 2 kids had pulled in just as the sun was setting, their car barely making it into the lot. The man had looked desperate, his shoulders heavy with worry, and his little girl had clung to his coat the same way Marcus's daughter had done all those years ago. Elijah had recognized the look in his eyes. It was the look of someone who had run out of options. Now, as Elijah stood under the bright lights of his garage, wiping his hands on an old rag, he looked up at the father, who had been anxiously pacing. "All right," Elijah said, nodding toward the car. "She's good to go. It was just a clogged fuel pump. Shouldn't give you any more trouble, but if it does, bring it back, and we'll take care of it." The man let out a breath of relief, running a hand over his face before shaking Elijah's hand. "I don't even know how to thank you," he said. "We were on our way to see my mother. She's in the hospital, and I was afraid we wouldn't make it in time." Elijah smiled knowingly, glancing toward the man's kids, who were sitting in the area, flipping through a set of coloring books he kept there just for moments like these. "No charge," he said simply. "Just get to where you need to be." The man's eyes widened. "What? No, I can't let you do that. You just spent hours working on this." Elijah held up a hand, shaking his head. "Consider it a Thanksgiving gift," he said, the words coming naturally. The man stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to figure out if this was real, if there were any strings attached. When he realized there weren't, his shoulders slumped, the tension leaving his body. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll never forget this." Elijah just nodded. "Safe travels." As the man walked away to gather his kids, something tugged at Elijah's memory. The familiarity of it all, the desperation, the gratitude, the weight of needing to be somewhere but not knowing if you'd make it. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his old wallet, flipping it open to where he kept a small but well-worn business card, its edges curled from time. Marcus Bennett, CEO, Bennett Motors. He smiled to himself, shaking his head at how life had come full circle. It was funny how the smallest choices, the moments that seemed insignificant at the time, could shape everything that came after. He turned to head back inside, but before he could, he felt a presence beside him. Marcus had arrived at some point during the night, standing near the entrance of the shop, watching the scene unfold. He wasn't in a suit this time, just a simple jacket, his hands in his pockets, a knowing smile on his face. "You didn't even hesitate," Marcus said. Elijah chuckled. "Didn't even think about it." Marcus nodded, looking around at the bustling shop, at the mechanics working in the bays, at the customers who still lingered, sipping coffee and chatting like they were all part of something bigger than just a business. "You ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't answered that phone call 3 years ago?" Elijah exhaled, glancing out at the darkened street beyond, the memories of that night playing in his mind. "Yeah," he said, "I think about it all the time." Marcus studied him for a moment before smirking. "And?" Elijah turned back to him, the warmth of the shop, of everything he had built, surrounding him. "I wouldn't change a damn thing." They stood there for a moment, side by side, before Marcus clapped a hand on Elijah's shoulder. "Come on," he said. "Let's go inside. I hear you make one hell of a Thanksgiving dinner." Elijah laughed, shaking his head as they walked back into the garage, where life hummed around them, where cars were fixed, where people were taken care of, where a single act of kindness had turned into something far greater than either of them could have ever imagined. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.